presentation. Now, it's my great pleasure to introduce Alfonse. I didn't even ask you the tone. How do I pronounce your last name? Alfonse Chiu? Which tone is?
Whichever sound you can make. I think speaking French is already close enough.
Okay, let's say first tone. Alfonse Chiu is an architectural historian, designer, and curator, and I would argue poet as well, working through the modalities of exhibition, publication, public programs, and performance. Chiu's research-based practice seeks to identify how systems of power and knowledge manifest through the production and circulation of visual, material, and spatial cultures to structure social definitions of value, property, and desires across the Anglo-tropics and the Pacific Rim, with a focus on East and Southeast Asia. Quite a program. Chiu was in Full 21 Efflux Journal Fellow, a cohort laureate of the inaugural Young Climate Prize in 2023, has published many essays for institutions such as Asian Film Archive, the Sharjah Architecture Triennial, essays in catalogs for the Singapore and Philippine pavilions at the 59th and 61st Venice Biennales, respectively, and they are currently editor at the Rock Band Art Museum in Shanghai, which I have to say is my favorite museum in China, and directs the Center for Urban Mythologies. I'll let you think of the acronym for this one. A research studio and para-institutional platform for critical and spatial and curatorial practice. Please welcome Alfonse for this discussion.
Thank you, Martin. And thank you so much to Rachel for the lovely presentation. For my section, please feel free to close your eyes as well. It's been a long day. And if you close your eyes, I don't have to make eye contact too hard because the lights are blinding. Terang bulan, terang di pinggir kali, buaya jembu di sangkalan mati. Jangan percaya mulutnya lelaki, berani sumpah tapi takut mati. Jangan percaya mulutnya lelaki, berani sumpah tapi takut mati. In Malaysia, where this song eventually became the national anthem, the story of Terang Bulan, or Bright Moon, is marked by murder, intrigue, royalty, and an uncertain provenance of European origin. Here, enshrined as a kind of foundational myth towards the sonic culture of the Malaysian nation-state, is a story that imagines a French colonial connection, a song titled La Rosalie, composed by Pierre-Jean de Béranger in the 19th century, a popular tune allegedly in the Seychelles that arrived in Malaya in the early 20th century via an exiled king, Abdullah Muhammad Shah II, the 26th Sultan of the northwest Malayan state of Perak. Shah, who was exiled in Seychelles until shortly before his death in 1922, was so punished because of his role in ordering the assassination of the British colonial administrator James Woodford Birch. And I realize that this is very far away. A year after Birch's formal appointment as the British resident of Perak, and nearly 2 years after the formalization of the landmark Pangkor Treaty on January 20, 1874. In contemporary Malaysia, Maharaja Lela, the local Malay tribal leader who was hired by Shah to serve as Birch's assassin and subsequently executed by the British authorities, has become something of a folk hero amongst the far right-wing ethno-nationalists for being an early martyr of anti-colonial resistance. Few would reference, however, to Lela's own vested financial interests as then, in fact, a slave catcher who made his living catching and selling both Perak locals and other indigenous people to feudal slave traders. On the other hand, neither were Birch's own professional activities identified in British accounts. Though experienced as a colonial administrator, Birch rarely spoke Malay, the language of the land, and in addition to seeking to abolish feudal slavery in Malaya, he also imposed new tax legislations and infrastructural projects that bypassed the customary authorities of local Malay leaders, punishing dissent through gestures of public humiliation, such as burning their homes and confiscating their weapons. Within this miasma of normative moral ambiguity, the looming context that needs to be mentioned was, of course, the premise of British interest in Malaya and Perak throughout the 19th century, the enormous tin deposits that made Perakian mines the top producer of tin in the world then. And it's a premise that can be actualized into a promise, first beginning with the signing of the Pangkor Treaty, which arose as the consequence of the power vacuum that arose following the death of the previous sultan. Forming a coalition between settler Chinese mine owners and businessmen, the Malay prince who broached and pitched the agreement to British colonial administrators did so with full knowledge of the political economy behind his claim to power. In this case, potential extraction was the key that delimited the colonial and imperial imagination that sought to exploit and accumulate. Not long after the first land tenure legislation was introduced in the Federated Malay States, the General Land Regulations of Perak in 1879. And the rest in Malaysia was, as we say, history. In composing this presentation, I return over and over again to the questions of land in Malaya and Malaysia. Who wants it? Who owns it? Who uses it? Because that is precisely where the trouble starts and lasts. Through thinking through land as assets, as property, entails a necessity of returning to its formation as an aggregate of desires. In this presentation, what I want to focus about is a slightly different scale and definition and intimacy, and to outline a modality refracted through the extractive apparatus of the plantation, but not the plantation. While legal scholars such as Shower Harris and Brenna Banda have produced excellent texts on the dynamics and definitions that undergird the modern Western conception of property as that which was based upon the propertizing of humans, or rather black enslaved people's life, in order to create a hybrid legal form that has both the status of object and human, and in doing so, verify the merger of whiteness with property ownership, I am much more interested here in the ways through which race beyond whiteness and blackness were produced as legal technologies to manage the risk and investments I so mentioned in the title of my presentation. This brings us to Pulau Carey, or Carey Island, a small island southwest of Kuala Lumpur that has been the site of an active plantation for more than a century and which seemed emblematic of the multiple forces and agent that characterizes the plantation as a frontier enterprise. Part of the ancestral land of the Macmeri, a small indigenous community, the land was acquired by British planters who cleared the land and established sprawling rubber estates staffed by a large residential population of Tamil and Chinese laborers, drastically reshaping the physical and social landscapes of the island. Subsequently renamed Carey Island from its original name, the plantation that was established has persisted beyond the course of the century and continues to operate even now after multiple rounds of corporate mergers, acquisitions, and demergers have altered its corporate ownership and structure beyond recognition. And as of yet, a round of real estate development ranging from a really terrible water park, as in really bad facilities, and resort that presents the plantation landscape as a forest retreat, to the master planning for converting the island into what will be Malaysia's first and largest megaport by the mid-21st century. Over the course of my visits to Malaysia between 2024 and 2025, an interesting document about Pulau Carey arrived to me from the National Archives of Malaysia, where I found a dossier detailing a visit by the British Colonial Propaganda Department to the island on September 1948 to conduct screenings of anti-communist films and to meet the local trade union. Taking place a little less than 3 months after the beginning of the Malayan emergency in the June of 1948, this visit was conducted at a time of intensifying counterinsurgency efforts led by the British Empire through the military forces of the Federations of Malaya and Commonwealth against the Malayan Communist Army, which sought to establish an independent communist Malayan state. Denoted as a state of emergency instead of a civil war, to avoid upsetting the London-based insurers of strategic assets and industries in Malaya, who would not pay out in the case of the latter, the nomenclature of what would become a decade of guerrilla warfare and scorched earth policy adopted by the colonial administration against any suspected communist elements were policies that were already tested in colonial peripheries, including, of course, occupied Palestine. While the most visible impact of the visit had been the 2 film shows that the mobile unit presented, which was so popular that the PR department allegedly received so many requests for future stagings, the amount of material surrounding the colonial news officer who authored the report served as a much more interesting project for me. Tellingly, across multiple passages in the article that was written, much was mentioned of the living and working conditions of the resident Indian plantation workers who were born, bred, and reared in their surroundings, I'm quoting, and the general state of apparent contentment and happiness in the plantation. Pillai's, or the officer's insistent repeated emphasis on the importance of the trade union, which are only 3,000 members, or only around 60% of the total workforce, ensuring that perfect harmony exists between the management and workers on all important matters of common interest, comes across as forced, placing what seems to be an undue weight to the centrality of the trade union to the daily life of the plantation workers. Indeed, the piece really worked hard to highlight the infrastructures and policies of the plantation that seemed to make Carey Island a model company town. And it was also quick to gush about the lushness of the plantation and the diligence of the workers. Miles of symmetrical rows of rubber tree on either side of 50 miles of roads, and green paddy fields flanked by towering coconut trees that were the result of zealous and industrial corporations of Indian settlers who repaired the ravages of destruction and neglect to the estate that occurred during the Japanese occupation of Malaya merely 3 years ago. A further motif of benevolent colonial paternalism was also infused in accounts of how the efficient organization and sympathetic administration of the estate have rendered it possible for the workers to live in happiness and peace, and various episodes of plantation administrators being lauded by workers, including one when 80-year-old Indian woman referred to the white general manager as a father figure who brought her up as his own daughter, and the other settlers as his own children. The tensions of the emergency re-enters in an unsubtle way, as noted in an incident where a Tamil youth was caught in a quarrel with a Malay constable due to an apparent misunderstanding that the constable had called him a communist, which was luckily resolved by the PR unit that was passing by. Furthermore, with the strident declaration that extremist elements have had no hold on the settlers all these years, nor will they ever have, the very word communist is anathema to them. If there's anything they dislike most, it is a communist. It becomes apparent that this article, which sought to consolidate the factors that made Carey Island a happy place for the workers and a productive center for the management, served as an ideological instrument meant to show readers of the political security of the Malayan plantation infrastructure. And with it, the reliability of Malaya's commodity production capacity that can stabilize the political regime of the post-World War II return of colonial rule, as well as temper the wildly volatile commodity market, for which Malaya was a major player in rubber production. Under this framing, the body politics of the plantation workers, whose mechanized labor is, as George Lukács described, progressively broken down into abstract, rational, specialized operations to enable the accelerating flow of commodity capital in a productive center, thus emerges as a political subject of profound importance. Intimately bound to British imperialism and its territorial expansions, the arrival and stay of Indian laborers in Malaya was induced by the explosive growth of large-scale agricultural enterprises following British takeover of the Malay Peninsula in the late 19th century, which required a large supply of cheap and available laborers in order to scale and be profitable. After the signing of the Bangor Treaty in 1874 between the Sultan of Perak and representatives of Great Britain, real power over the administration of the Sultanate of Perak was transferred to the British colonial administration and kick-started a cascading process with other sultanates that eventually resulted in the formation of the Federated Malay State in 1895, cementing British presence and control over a significant portion of the Malay Peninsula. The result of this was tremendous. Having attained a measure of absolute power, the British was now free to develop and organize its new territories in the service of imperial growth, moving from previous modes of informal imperialisms of free trade to the more formal imperialisms of protectionist economic expansion that enabled the complete penetration of new administrative and legal infrastructures over land, labor, and industry, amongst others. Identifying the Malaya's abundance of natural resources and needing to address issues of overdependence on tin, as well as capital losses that arose from failures by European ventures and mining in the Malayan economy, imperial interests saw great potentials for agricultural development given its soil fertility, tropical climate, and abundance of land that was made newly available through this shift in power balance, thus enabling tropical commodities to be planted and exported for great profit. In order to make plantation agriculture profitable against the volatility of the world commodity market, capitalists needed to produce at scale while reducing cost of operation. Though able to access cheap land to plant with, the limited starting capital available to many aspiring European entrepreneurs was massively constrained whose massive constraints can only be circumvented through the availability of a large, cheap, and ready workforce who can handle the intense labor of plantation work and the demands of plantation owners with obedience, the exploitation of whom will allow for capitalists to appropriate the surpluses of their labor and smoothen the accumulation of capital against market uncertainties. The role of the colonial state thus became central to the success of any burgeoning plantation enterprise through its legal institutions, economic policies, and capacity to provide cheap and easy credit and laborers and other instruments of entrepreneurial development that laid the legal foundation of capitalism in a colonial context. The question of where this workforce will come from constituted a major problem for the colonial state to solve. For one, the local Malay peasants were present, they were unsuitable for plantation work due to both political and economic factors. And another group that were deemed unsuitable were the Chinese. Though they were particularly present in trade and commercial sectors and major settlements, the British were relatively uninterested and at times outright hostile and jealous to the possibility of a Chinese workforce. This then leads us to the South Asian workforce from the Madras Presidency, where engineered man-made famines under British occupation has rendered local peasants desperate and eager to leave and escape, and thus accept less than optimal arrangements in order to work in Malaya. Between the 19th century to the mid-20th century, as many as 4.5 million Indian workers entered Malaya, of which 3 million left or were repatriated to India during the same period. 500,000 would remain in Malaya as they declared independence to become Malaysian citizens, with the last million attributed to deaths that occurred due to the conditions of their labor, such as from exhaustion, malnutrition, diseases, snake bites, tigers, so many tigers, alongside many who were born in Malaya itself. In the lead up to the complete abolition of slavery in the British Empire in 1833, Indian workers had gradually replaced slaves in working for colonial industries gathered from across British India. The coolie trade effectively took the place of slavery and was legalized in 1837 to provide a stable and sustainable supply of cheap laborers across the British Empire. Now, this dynamic has essentially been maintained over the ages in the contemporary era, as Malaysian Tamil workers were gradually replaced with cheaper Indonesian laborers who fulfilled the same structural functions as they once did. From rubber before to oil palm now, the specter of race, labor, land, bodies, capital, risk, and investments continue to intertwine and co-constitute each other as they did a decade, a century ago. In thinking beyond, for example, what Mbembe referred to as a necropolitic, I want to thus maybe venture a possibility of a necroeconomic, a thought that occurred to me as I walked through the surreal estate of Pulau Carey between its archival incarnations and the soils of its presence. And in doing so, I think back to Terang Bulan and its refrains. Jangan percaya mulutnya lelaki, berani sumpah tapi takut mati. Don't believe a man's word. He dares to pledge, but he's afraid of dying. Thank you.